Very different, isn't it? Such a different problem for us. Yeah. Yeah, and one feels that. I had an interesting dialogue with Father Václav Malý, the priest who was involved in the Velvet Revolution and tortured and terrible, 250 times in prison. And he's telling me, what that was like and how you're in prison there and these brutal guards are assaulting him and he's standing there saying, he says, then you know you have nothing to fall back on except faith and belief. And I'm sitting here listening to that and to think, how does that translate? Now, I've never been in prison like that. And I've never been brutalized like that. But what does it mean to be faithful to the gospel in our setting? It seems to me Richard Rohr was trying to speak to that. What does it mean to be faithful to Christ here and now in this culture which seems to be dominated by the demons called consumerism and individualism and privatization? The ones I've been trying to identify here. What does it mean to be faithful in this kind of world with an environmental crisis and so on? But it just feels different. And as you said, the problem doesn't seem to be that somebody wants to throw us in prison or say we can't preach. It's to co-opt us subtly, for the most part. Subtle co-optation where we are now. That's what it means. How much is our consciousness technologized? How much is it influenced by consumerism? And that becomes so hard to feel and see unless you can step out of your culture in some way. Or the prophetic voices tell us about it. I like that. Co-optation, I think, is our problem and not the kind that Father Malý knew in Czechoslovakia or people knew in Russia. I want to move forward in my second part of this presentation here. We're going till 3:45, by the way, is my timetable that I was told. Now, the question becomes, well, how do you tell our students we got this wisdom tradition? I mean, how do you pass it on? How do we facilitate that ministerial function that we call appropriating the faith in the document empowered by the Spirit? How do you find a practical theology that will speak to the academic community? I mean, that's the kind of thing that seems to me to come up as soon as we take seriously our responsibilities here. And the first kind of introductory comment I'll make along that line is I'm following David Tracy a lot here. Plurality and ambiguity and some other things he did in theological studies. And I was once in an elevator with David after hearing one of his talks. And I said, Dave, would you just tell me what you said? Would you, please? Tracy is unbelievable intellect, but sometimes it's a little hard to know what he said. Anyway, I'm borrowing from Tracy for a lot of this, and therefore none of it makes sense. No. No, three kind of things that we would find in religion that make up a concrete religion. One is the experiential part, the experience of following Christ or giving allegiance to the Buddha, living it out. Secondly, there is the reflective side, thinking about that. And thirdly, there is the institutional element that makes up religion. So you got creeds and dogmas and sacraments and hierarchy and all that. Well, it's very important in a concrete religion to make sure those three functions are attended to. Now, that's where I locate appropriating the faith. I'm glad we picked that term in the pastoral. The more I think about it, the more I like it. And that is, it's a suggestion that what we're talking about here is not just learning some doctrines, or not just taking a European tradition that Karl Rahner wrote and handing it to our people, whether they're professors or students. No, it's not in some sort of isolated fashion to take a theology that's unconnected with the culture, something like Cardinal Ratzinger wants us to do. It's not like that. If we're going to talk theology, theological reflection, or whatever appropriating the faith is about, it has to have an experiential base. It's somehow an effort to reflect on life on relationships, on society, on ourself, our connection with other people, with the world, and with the ultimate that we like to call God. So that component, you can be too rational, as Chesterton pointed out to us in many different ways. You can be too rational, but you can't be too intellectual. You can't be too insightful, like Bernard Lonergan says. You can't get carried away. So the reason I'm saying all this, of course, is we live in a world of anti-intellectualism. And when it seeps into the university, it really disturbs me. And when we see it in the campus ministry circles, then it makes me feel bad. I don't think that we got to find a way as campus ministers not to be anti-intellectual. I don't presume that applies to anybody, who chose to come to this workshop. But to our friends, the anti-intellectual friends that we might have, then we have to find a way. It won't work to say, reason. It's not reason, and it's not reading Rahner's Foundations and being able to regurgitate it. It's got to do with intellectual reflection on our experience. It's got to do with finding a way to sort out the images that are already in our imagination. It's a whole person kind of effort. It doesn't leave out emotion, doesn't leave out imagination. In fact, it has to build on those. It asks, what do we value? What's in our heart? What do we treasure? And we have to sort it out, analyze it, synthesize it, make sense out of it for ourselves, and to be able to hand it on to others. So that's right away seems important to me to figure out what this appropriating the faith is all about. Now, first, that's sort of an introductory comment on all of that. Next thing is a way of saying it positively, and that is to retrieve the wisdom in our tradition, to make it available to our students for their reflection on their lives and on their relationship to others in the world. To retrieve, now that word comes from Heidegger and the whole hermeneutical tradition. To retrieve means to bring it back out of the tradition and make it available so people can use it. It's very pragmatic. That's all. I always think of a homily or a class or even this. It's got something to do. How do I grab hold of something and get it out there so people could appropriate it, make it their own, so then they can reflect on their own situation? When I first met Karl Rahner, he said to me, don't become a disciple. Don't be a disciple. Go do in your setting what I try to do in this Germanic academic setting. I took that seriously. Karl Rahner never went to school, a movement. You got to do it. And that's what we're trying to help our students to do. Now, to try to speak to the question here of what we have to be able to do, therefore, is to help our students to see that there's a need, that there's something lacking in what they're trying to do. In other words, our students are going to do theology no matter what. They're going to figure out how they relate to the ultimate. The question is, are they going to do it well or shoddily? They're going to do it with help or on their own. They're going to do it in isolation or in tune with the larger tradition. That's the real question. They're going to do it. Everybody does it. We've done it. Maybe some of us continue to do it. Figure out who we are, where we fit, how we find, as Sharon Park said, how do we compose meaning in a crazy, mixed up kind of world. So we have to be able to tell our students in some way that, hey, there's help here. Now, I know a lot of my preaching and teaching is along that line. We got a wisdom. Instead, we don't have a law about what to do sexually. We don't even have principles. In a way we do, but I don't like to talk about that. We got a wisdom about sexuality. And let's look at it. Something that could locate us, help us to know how to deal with it. So, my first point is that we're trying to retrieve a wisdom, trying to get hold of it. And of course, that means that we got to know it. And that sets up our own task to continue to read, to study, and I know as well as any of you do that it's tough. I mean, you got time constraints and so on, but you got to have something to say, and you ought to have something better to say tomorrow than you did today. You know, I mean, that's it. And unless we're growing that way, our preaching, teaching, counseling becomes stale, it seems to me. So the first thing, as soon as you start retrieving the wisdom tradition, is to retrieve it for ourselves. We got to appropriate it, or we can't do anything with it, and we got to keep working. And it means to see theology as an ally, to try to create a climate where this is seen as welcome. Not that the reflection is the end. I like to say it's secondary. The reflection is secondary. Experience is primary. To be a good person is more important than to think about it. Living well is more important than theology. But that doesn't make it unimportant. Look, you want to let me finish the segment? Or you're going to burst? You're going to burst. Go ahead. Yeah.
Reacting to the tradition as old-fashioned, it impedes retrieval.
Yeah, I will, and I would. That's a great lead-in. Thanks for the next thing. I want to specify this retrieval thing. It seems to me the retrieval notion has a couple of different components in it. One is the refocusing. To refocus. Now, we all got a perfect example of that in liberation theology. And what Richard said this morning. That's a refocusing effort. That is, one goes back, looks at the biblical tradition, looks at the long tradition in the light of current experience and says, we see something different. So if you read the Bible from the viewpoint of the poor, you see something you didn't see before. If you ask yourself what St. Francis was all about, you see something before you didn't see before. And if you analyze the current theologies today, same thing will happen. So one needs, as part of it, is refocusing. And the feminist theology, if we read Rosemary Ruther's book, Sexism and God Talk, you see a perfect example of that. To latch on to the prophetic tradition is found within the biblical period that seems to critique in some way or another patriarchy. So that's what Rosemary is about, refocusing. And we have to do that. And that's part of what we have to learn to do. I mean, usually we get our leads from the important theologians and so on that help us. The second thing that we have to do is reinterpret. That is, we have to find a way to take that wisdom and say it in a way that makes sense for our people today. Now, I think about sin. Now, sin is sort of verboten. Don't talk about it. College students don't need to hear about it. We don't want to lay guilt trips on them. They get too many heavy things. They come from divorced family. They heard heavy preaching when they were little and so on. So, as Carl Menninger said, the problem with clergy, you put it into a zone of silence. But the idea with sin isn't to forget it, but it's to reinterpret it, to talk about it in a way that doesn't sound heavy and moralistic and yet retains the fundamental meaning. So I find that students are very open to talking about the fact that they disappoint themselves, that there's a gap between ideals and behavior, and sometimes it's sort of our fault that there's that gap. Now, I mean, that would be my one example I would use of reinterpreting the tradition to talk about a crucial reality that it makes sense to our young people. And that's, of course, what we're always having to do. The interplay, again, is between the ongoing living life, and the question, I presume, directs us to say the traditio, the handing on, continues on to the very moment, so that we become part of the shaping of that tradition. I was thinking about that today with the liturgy this morning and the stuff I've seen around the country and how much campus ministry is involved in the traditio. The handing on of the tradition right now, the reinterpreting of that in the light of our situation. I don't think any of us want to say we're great at it or perfect by any means, but boy, I tell you, there's a lot of good stuff going on where the reinterpretation of the traditional symbols is happening. Again, to go back to Ricoeur, I guess I used it before, it's the second naivete. There's a first naivete about symbols. It's like the assumption, or let's say the ascension, is the question is how high up did he go, or where did he go? That's a naive sort of question about the ascension. But we move beyond that and we move to a reinterpretation of ascension and try to find out what that means in terms of the lordship of Jesus and his presence. It's a statement about presence, isn't it? Not of absence. And that shows you the lengths to which reinterpretation has to go. And very often the language is almost the exact opposite. That's a good one. Ascension means to most people he went up and left. Whereas ascension, the real meaning of ascension is that Christ is here. It's like it's reinterpreting Trinity or Christology or any of the great doctrines. It's like Carl Jung saying the Assumption is the most important religious statement made since the Reformation. That's coming from a non-Catholic, non-traditional Orthodox Christian. What does that mean? I love to preach on the Assumption. Just based on Jungian insights about the feminine, importance of the feminine, importance of bodiliness, importance of understanding final fulfillment, so on. Anyway, that's an example of reinterpretation and what is part of this retrieval kind of things. Our conviction, of course, is we got a long, rich tradition that's worth retrieving. There's a lot of resources there. It's good and bad. It's ambivalent. There's a lot of sinfulness, a lot of goofy ideas, a lot of weird saints. But there's a lot of good stuff in there that we want to grab hold of. We have to know it, make it available, bring it forward for people. So that's truncated version of what I had intended to say about that, but maybe I've made my point. Now, the next thing, of course, in this, how we're doing this practical theology, how we reappropriating is we got to know the audience. We got to know who we're talking to. Well, and the first thing when we begin to think about this, the rubric under which I wanted to address that is postmodernism. Now, obviously you can go all kind of ways, and we got to listen to our students, know and everything, and some people who are good at knowing television and music and so on all have a handle on what they're feeling and thinking. That's all to the advantage. I'm looking at it in a larger sort of macro analysis of what's going on in the world that these students inhabit and what ends up shaping their consciousness. So I want to parse out a bit of what we mean by postmodernism. Fundamentally, postmodernism, for many authors, is an understanding that the Enlightenment ideals are running their course. What's run our Western civilization all the way, Industrial Revolution, urbanization, French Revolution, Enlightenment. Enlightenment ideals say that reason will show us the way to success and progress. Science will do it for us. Progress will be assured if we follow those approaches. And what has happened, of course, in our world is all those great realities are now seen to be ambivalent. Reason itself we see as ambivalent. Some people are too rational. They forgot their soul, forgot their emotions. Pure, objective reason doesn't make it. And we begin to see that. Reason, it can be a tool for destructive things. We begin to analyze power. How some people use their reason to put other people down. And academics are good at this, of course. Use your specialty, your expertise, not to enlighten or to facilitate or to enable or to relate, but as a weapon, as a tool. So we begin to see reason itself and knowledge is ambivalent itself. It doesn't give us automatically a better sort of life. Then we, of course, see the ambivalence of science. Science gives us ways to keep little babies alive. It helps cut down on polio. It's done all kind of good things, but it's also given us pollution and nuclear weaponry. And we're ambivalent about that. It's not clear. You can't let the scientists run the world. You can't allow that because it will go in faulty directions. And then we see progress itself is called into question. And that Christopher Lash's book symbolizes that whole understanding that progress in the Western world, everything's going to get better, improve the GNP. That's all we'll hear in the next year. How are we going to improve the GNP? How are we going to do this? And, there's a more fundamental question. Is that the way one lives better? Is there something else that has to be done and said? So that we see the ambivalence of all of these major realities, the themes that the Enlightenment played up. I don't want to be against the Enlightenment entirely. It has to be a critique of the Enlightenment that's dialectical. I want to save freedom. No, we can't. We got to be careful. You realize our history as a church, this is really fascinating, isn't it? Modernity. How did we react to modernity when all this stuff started? Totally negative, symbolized by the syllabus of errors. What was Pope Pius IX was against everything. Freedom of the press, democracy, well, you name it, anything that was modern, that was part of modernity, the church was against. What did we have at the turn of the century? The condemnation of modernism. What did we slay our theologian in the United States for? A form of modernism. Church was against it all the way. And when did we finally make our peace with modernism? At the Second Vatican Council. You know what Skillebeck said about that in retrospect? Isn't it interesting? I could probably get the exact quote here. I have it someplace, but maybe I'll paraphrase it. And that is, Skillebeck said something like this. For 2 centuries we fought against modernism, modernity. And then finally when we accepted it at the very minute that the modern world began to see through it. It's Greeley's law. The church always starts everything when everyone else left it. It forgot it. It's like all the management techniques we use these days, all from a preceding era in the business world, when the business world figured out all that stuff doesn't make any sense and fired all these middle management people and tried to give people autonomy, figure out how they don't fit in the flow chart. That's what they want to do. Because the people who don't fit in the flow chart get things done. And here we are in the church trying to get everybody in a flow chart. This model here, we all know who we report to or something. Big thing is to get to the position where you don't have to report to anybody. That's where you can get things done. A little facetious there. Anyway, what was I on? What sparked that emotional outburst? What? Yes, the church, Skillebeck's. Yeah, right when modernity, as he said, began to distrust itself, that's when we accepted it. Right when we already had the critique of the Frankfurt School, Habermas and those people, of the Enlightenment ideals, there we are. So we got a difficult history here. So we have to figure out what's going on, what kind of world are these students of ours living in. It's a world that is far more ambivalent than the Vatican Council's document on the church in the modern world even dreamed of. So we're more aware of the feminist critique, of the oppression and the totalitarian trends, etc. Now, the other element of postmodernity that seems important to me is the change of consciousness that results because of the media. So what has shaped our consciousness in modernity was the printing press, the ability to read. It helped create the Protestant Reformation, created linear thinking, created people who liked the great books and who liked logical argumentation, and where we would get together and we could all talk about Plato's dialogues or something else. It created a mode of consciousness that was linear. And of course, whenever any new mode of communication comes in, like the printing press, you get a big change. So with the advent of television, the modern media, we get a change in the way people think. The change in the mode of consciousness. People are much more into images, new kind of energies released. I draw a lot on Joe Holland's work here, where he distinguishes masculine and feminine energy. And he says what's gone wrong in modernity is the masculine energy got attached to the technological world, and it became dominate, improve, get the GNP going, a lot of that, and all of the feminine energy, as he calls it, got related to religion and became private. And he says, well, we move in a new age, in post-modernity, post-modern world, we move into a situation where we've at least got the chance to join masculine and feminine energy in co-creation. It is that we can have different kind of technologies, solar technologies, other approaches to dealing with the world, befriend the world, dream of the earth, and so on. And we can move religion out of the private sphere back into the public world. That's the challenge of postmodernity. Modernity messed us up in those two fundamental ways. It gave us pollution, scientism, technologism, and it gave us private religion. And that's our bane. That's what messes up. That's why we can't preach about the marketplace or the bishops on the economy. People are privatized. And so postmodernity represents a chance to bring the two things together, masculine and feminine energy, in some sort of healthy synergism. Yeah, that's a good word. Synergism is what we need to carry us forward. Then, to complete this section here, we're talking about appropriating the faith, getting the wisdom, knowing the tradition, studying, all that. Then we're talking about who we're talking to and what are the shaping factors in our culture that create the postmodern students we have to deal with. And everyone understands that doesn't mean every student we're talking to is postmodern. A lot of them are back on the farm, living in some other world. We all know that. But they live in a world where these other factors will begin to impinge on their consciousness. Now the question is, how do you relate the two? How do the two come together? And that is, first, the negative statement. And that is, we have a whole line of thought in our Catholic tradition right now that doesn't see a great need to relate it. It's represented by Hans Urs von Balthasar in his multi-volume work, The Glory of the Lord. And it's represented by his great patron, the guy who threw a birthday party for him on his 80th birthday, Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger. These people are, in a sense, anti-correlational. That is, the way they see it is, what you've got to do is shore it up. You got to pull it together. And Balthasar did a magnificent job of that. I mean, his achievement is almost unimaginable. And how he pulled the tradition together and gave it a new shape, a new, powerful, new direction under the heading not of truth or goodness, but of beauty. And it's wonderful. And I want to learn from that about contemplation and how to reinterpret Dante and Origen. It's just marvelous. But it's for our purposes, I think, it's not correlational enough. It's like the great scripture scholar who I heard give a sermon on covenant. And it was magnificent, pulled together throughout the old tradition, the Bible, the New Testament covenant. It was wonderful. And he asked me afterwards, he says, well, what did you think of the homily? And I said, it was masterfully put together, but it won't play in Peoria or in Toledo. It won't play because it's not correlational. Because you can sit there and say, what's that got to do with me? You can sit there as an objective observer and say, that's beautiful. Wow, what a masterful synthesis. Just like I react to Balthasar's work. What a masterful synthesis. But what's it got to do with college students trying to figure out whether they should cheat in class or not? Or how to make sense out of their relationships? And so, negative statement first is, whatever you and I do, it's got to be correlational. That is, it's got to figure out how to put together the wisdom tradition with the real existential concerns of our students and the faculty, the people we deal with in the academic community. You've got to learn how to put them together. And it's, it's like you're sitting up there giving this great homily on marriage, and guy's sitting, and it's a beautiful covenant of love, and some guy in the back sitting there thinking, I'll give him covenant, he ought to come and live in my house for a while. That's where we lose. Or you're teaching a class all about the incarnation, and somebody at the end of it says, but, and, what's that got to do with me? In other words, as Tracy says it, apologetics, what we call fundamental theology, is an essential, inexorable part of systematic theology. And that, of course, is what my mentor, Karl Rahner, was so good at. And that's why Balthasar dismissed Rahner. And why he had a big fight, and why Ratzinger is afraid of Rahner. It's got that whole flavor to it. It's too correlational. Well, I mean, maybe I'll make the point too strongly, because maybe some people have found out how to take Balthasar or Ratzinger or those people and make it correlational. And I don't have a problem with that. In fact, I think it's great. I have a seminarian I'm close to who's on that project and trying to do it. And I think it's wonderful, so I don't want to overplay that. But what I do know is we have to figure out how to relate with this tradition to these students and these faculty members. The model I have in mind is a conversation. It's a conversation that goes on. It's not one way. It's not us sitting there saying this is how it is. It's a listening as well as a speaking. I remember I was giving a talk one time in the Detroit area, and I forget what the topic was. I was talking about social justice, the church speaking to the culture about justice and so on. And Tony Kosnick, people know Tony, wrote on sexuality. The Pope personally got rid of Tony. You know, they were friends beforehand, got rid of him at Orchard Lake and so on. And Tony's got a history, you know, so he raised his hand. He says, don't forget, Jim, it flows the other way too. We have a lot to learn from the culture about justice and about how it ought to work. The corporate world's doing better by women than the church is. The Brooklyn Dodgers integrated before many Catholic churches did. No, you had a whole history where it flows the other way. And so it's a conversation that's created, a listening to the culture, and a lot of times our students speak that to us. It's one of the great blessings in our work, isn't it? They can tell us about what they feel and see about that culture in which they live. It's part of our antennae into it. And but then we get this conversation going. Now, from my perspective, when you enter the conversation, however, there's a normative partner. And the normative partner for us is that Christian tradition. The cross is judge of the flag. Otherwise, you're going to have nationalism. You're going to have Constantine repeated, as Richard said today. You're going to have nothing but a culturized religion. And that's, of course, what Ratzinger and Balthasar feared. It's what Karl Barth feared in the great project of Schleiermacher and liberal Protestant theology. If you play ball with the culture, you'll lose. And that sets, if we're going to be correlational, that puts us on alert. We've got to be really careful that we don't get, word used before, co-opted. The great problem becomes co-optation. I'm always saying to campus ministers, we've got to move to the center. Got to move to the center. Don't stay on the sidelines. Don't be in the ghetto. Get to know the president, the vice presidents, the academic deans. Get on committees. Get involved in the center of campus life. And a lot of us work at that, but when we get there, we can't be a house lackey. And that's the great danger. When we get there, when we get some of that entree and some of that respect, which I think we need and should be striving for all the time, we can't forget that the cross is judge of the flag, that the normative partner in the dialogue for us is Jesus Christ and the tradition. Otherwise, I think that we really lose out. In dealing with our young people, we have to deal with the problem of doubt. Doubt as we try to correlate this for them. Does it make any sense, this tradition? Just a few words about that. We don't want to claim too much. We can't claim you can have absolute certitude about all these doctrines. What we've got is the appropriation of a whole symbol system. It doesn't make any difference if you can explain transubstantiation or the presence of the Lord. It doesn't make any difference if you don't understand what he descended into hell means. Because nobody totally appropriates the whole tradition and understands it. Nobody, not the Pope or anybody else. In that sense, Greeley's analysis of the communal selective Catholic is too narrow. Because every Catholic is selective, from the Pope on down. Everybody selects out what works for them. Some people like Luke's gospel and forget John. Other people like the incarnation and forget about any of the other resurrections. All of us are selective. And so we can't make our students try to have a higher standard than we have for ourselves and everybody else, knowing and understanding and appropriating the whole thing. Can't do it. You appropriate elements that work for us. It's very pragmatic. As Tracy says, it's a criteria of relative adequacy to our experience. It's relative adequacy. Lonergan taught us that. He says, what is the judgment? The judgment we make is when there are no further relevant questions. As Tracy likes to say, enough is enough. And that's good wisdom in helping our students. We can't solve every intellectual problem. Why pretend we can? I can't solve them for myself. How am I going to do it for them? We live with a certain relative adequacy. Rahner once wrote an amazing article. It says, why are you a Christian? And here's this great theologian, the greatest since Thomas Aquinas. And what is his answer? Well, I'm a Christian because I was born one. And I haven't found anything better. On two criteria. I haven't found anything that would help me live more nobly or help me understand the deep questions of life in greater detail or ability to understand it. Two criteria. I haven't found anything better. And I think that's a good way to deal with the kind of doubts. Is some other better way to deal with the death of your mother than a belief in immortality, afterlife, heaven, whatever that symbolizes for us? Maybe enough said. We have to see the great importance in this whole appropriating the faith in this relation of symbol, of imagination. The good teacher, the good preacher finds the symbols that collect, that bring opposing tendencies together, that people remember and talk about. So if we're into escapism that's involved in our culture and the readings from Jonah, and I talk about the Jonah syndrome, getting on a boat, trying to get away from God, and getting thrown overboard, storm, whale, all that. It's a wonderful symbol of escapism, isn't it? And so I can preach on the Jonah syndrome, and sure enough, somebody during the coming week will come up and say, you're talking about the Jonah syndrome? Now, if I would have given an intellectual analysis, a rational analysis of escapism, what did I preach about? I could ask them 2 minutes later. I don't know. I forgot. It's the image, the symbol that we resurrect, refocus, reinterpret, bring forward to pull it together that seems to be part of all of this. Let me stop there. Can we do our one-to-one? Would you find another partner? And talk to somebody else and maybe use it to stand up. I want to get to the practical side of this yet. Can you stay with me for a while, I hope? Let's try to find a new partner. That means you have to move. What do you do? Time is limited. Maybe the conversations get carried on elsewhere or we appropriate in our own ways. I'm going to say something about the practical side of this, and then I want to then hopefully save time for questions and comments. The first point in the sort of strategic side of this is the great importance of having experiential approaches to doing theology with our people. And I don't think we get good modeling from this from our great theologians, so we're left to our own devices often. I think of things we try to do when our students come back from Appalachia. Before they go, I might say a prayer with them, alert them to some things, and then after they come back, sit down with them in a group discussion and ask the kind of questions, well, what did this mean to you? Is there any way, and seems like a ministry to you? Did you pray over it at all? What did you learn anything from the people? And use that as a springboard. In other words, you almost use a CPE kind of thing. I usually ask one student to prepare and say, well, just tell me really in detail what it all meant to you. Did you pray? How did you feel about this? Get one person primed to do a careful remembrance of the event and then begin to reflect on it. What did it mean in terms of our biblical tradition, our Catholic heritage, and so on? I find it hard. Maybe others do it more easily, but I'm convinced that it's the way to go. We can do that with a lot of other things, too, that happen. I mean, I think of the Last Temptation of Christ, when it was so popular, we used it as a teachable moment for people to say what happened to them as they went through it. Any of these cultural things that everyone else, some of our conservatives said, don't touch all that stuff. It always seems to us just the opposite. They're the great teachable moments that occur, suicide on campus or whatever else, to get people to talk about it. But our job is to be the one who keeps coming back to the tradition, to the great wisdom that we have, and to see how available we can make it. One of the things we do, we have an annual Catholic faculty staff assembly. And at the assembly, we do it over lunch and try to make a big deal out of it. And we ask one of our faculty members to say what it means to be a Catholic in this university setting. And we're beginning to assemble material over a number of years where people reflect on their values and the teachings and what it all means. And then the other people hear it, and we hope to promote more reflection along that line. We have what we call our Emmaus program, our small group thing, which we try to gather folks, again, trying to center on the experiential side. I meet with a group of faculty members on Fridays, and we discuss the scripture readings for that Sunday. And again, I'm always trying to move it in the direction of what does that mean to you? Now, I find it's great for preparing homilies and very valuable to me to hear, but I think my role as a catalyst, bring them back to that. We provide them with the commentary and do it without any preparation. We send them out, mail it out to them with the scripture gospel reading only, one or two commentaries, one page, don't have to prepare, get there, sit down. And sometimes a year we provide lunch for them. They can sit down and read it in 5 minutes or so while we're all quiet around the table. And then we open up the discussion, again, pushing it in that direction.